Trigger warning. This story contains references to assault, corporal punishment, and death. She felt her mother's hand tighten once more, not a squeeze of comfort, but a command. "Keep them together," the woman said, voice thin as the coin she had been given. The market was full of shouted prices and the tang of sweat and coffee. A child's hand was let go, and, in that little release, a pact was made. This is the story of 20 years of silence broken. A slave fulfills a promise to her mother with a machete. Subscribe to this channel to keep forgotten stories alive. They tell the beginning like a picture. The mother's face, streaked with dust and with a hunger that has a sound, pressing something small and warm into another's palm. The hand belonged to a girl no older than 12 when the man in the ledger signed his name, and an unfamiliar driver led them away. Her name then was Candida, though for years what remained of her name was the promise rolled like a stone in her chest. Keep them together. Keep them safe. 20 years is a long time to carry an oath. It can harden and outline a life. In the first handful of years on the fazenda, the promise was small and immediate. Keep the younger ones fed, keep the youngest with you, keep the laugh in Davy's voice from being flattened. The promise lived in small rituals. At dawn she lit the kitchen fire with the same 2 sticks, stirred the coffee ashes in the same iron pot until the bitter steam rose and sank into the rafters. She skimmed oil from the beans and fed boys and girls who would not belong to her, when noon cut the light like a blade through leaves. She flung the pot onto the coals when the bell at the main house called the men to the fields. She tied a cloth around her hair the way she had seen her mother do, an old geometry of knots and patience. The farm belonged to Baron Henrique de Souza, a man with a gait like a judge's who never needed to raise his voice to make his will known. His wife, the Baronesa, moved through rooms of linen and silver and never had to consider the stink of sweat on a child's shirt. Below them moved the Faitors, Antonio, who had a grin that lasted too long, Ricardo, solid and quick with a stick, and Paulo, whose eyes sometimes came soft when he watched the children, and sometimes came hard when the Baron called. Each of these men mapped the order of the plantation, who rose when who carried water, who bent under the yoke of a world that pretended to have rules where there were only debts. From the kitchen, always the kitchen, Candida watched. She watched the rows of coffee trees drenched with dawn and the bright, pulsing labor of harvest. She watched Tomás, older than her by a few years, and already wrapped in a stillness that came from having to keep the others safe. He carried the work as if it were a second skin, steady, uncomplaining, hands like small plows. She watched Madalena, who saved every ribbon she could lay her hands on, who would braise a braid and then look down as if embarrassed she had wanted beauty at all. And she watched Davy, who was born when their mother's hands were almost cold with work, and whose laughter was an instrument, high, unafraid, quick to be given away. Davy's laugh was a small rebellion every morning, a slice of joy in the relentless economy of the plantation. He would whistle while the beans were picked. He would hide the kettle lid and make some of the older boys chase him until the sun fell. The promise was not spoken every day. It resided in the quiet spaces, the way Candida folded the last piece of bread into Madalena's apron, the way she lingered to tighten Tomás's bootlace, the way she corrected Davy's whistling so that he might learn cadence and caution. It sat like a pebble she would sometimes turn in her palm when the nights were thick, and the owl called 3 times from the jacaranda at the lot's edge. The owl's call became an omen, not of something supernatural, but of measurement. 3 notes, and the night was counted, the family accounted for. The farm had its own small cruelties, not always brutal in the way of a whip, but precise and unavoidable. Work began with the bell at dawn, a sound that came like a law. The bell found the children even in sleep. It found the ones who had been promised away, and those whose mothers had stayed. It found the Baronesa sipping her tea and the Baron standing on his portico with his ledger. There were days when small mercies appeared. The cook would leave a crust of bread, or Paulo would leave an extra palm of beans near the children's sleeping pallet. Those moments kept hope from hardening into despair. The first time Antonio looked at Madalena in a way that made Candida's palms sweat, it felt absurd and petty. How could a look hold that much weight? But looks metastasize into gestures. A hand that lingers at an elbow, an offered compliment that is a trespass against a child's skin. These are the first small measures of long harm. Candida learned, early and with an instinct that made her blood cold, to watch Antonio's steps. When he came near the kitchen at odd hours, how he pretended to search for a tool, how he lingered by the pots. She learned to place herself as a shield between him and her sister, to slide a bowl between his line of sight and Madalena's face. She learned to laugh when she was frightened, to lower her voice and make her warnings a joke. When warning became action, Candida's words hit the wood of the Baronne's door and fell away. She told the Baronessa one afternoon, fingers still smelling of soap, voice thin but steady. He keeps staring at Madalena, milady. He goes into the servant rooms when no one is there. The Baronessa folded her hands and closed her eyes, the way a woman might close a book she does not intend to read. She said, with the economy of someone who had never been touched by the hard edges of the world, "I will speak to the foreman." The foreman did not change his path. He had orders from other men whose names were heavy, in ways that made complaining an exercise in futility. Candida tried other routes. She spoke to Paolo, who often let his gaze rest on the children as though considering whether a life might bend toward mercy. He listened in a way that made the kitchen light change, as if a man might be stilled by remorse. "I will watch," he said once, and he did. He watched with the small gestures of a man who could not confront power without losing his own place. He left water where the girls could hide, slowed the dogs on certain nights, turned a face away when certain men passed. But men like Antonio were not stopped by small mercies. They persisted. The plantation's cruelty was structural and permitted, braided into the routines and the ledgers and the quiet nods of men who accepted orders. Tomas's patience had limits. The day he lashed out was not loud, at least not at first. It was an ordinary afternoon in the fields, wind carrying the coffee blossom like an offering. Antonio said something to Madalena, a phrase that cut the air and made the birds go silent in their shocked way. Tomas moved like one who had rehearsed restraint and found it slipping. He shoved. Words became hands. Other men intervened. Later, when the sun had not yet fallen, Tomas stood before a post and felt leather braid across his back. The lash left crescents on his skin, each one a small ledger of punishment for daring to protect. They tied him to the column in the central yard, and the bell did not pause to ask if this was justice. It only called the rest of the world to work. What did it mean to be punished for mercy? To be beaten when one defended another? For Candida, it was a message delivered in blunt force. The place where she stood, the one that held her promise, was being maimed to teach all loyalty its limits. Tomas's face after the beating was a map of a man who had given his back to a cause and found only broken glass. He smiled then, once, at Davy. A thin half-moon of a smile meant to reassure someone who could not understand the cost. Candida folded her hands and carried both the promise and the image of Tomas's wound. At night, she would press oil to his scars and whisper into his hair, as if her voice might stitch skin back into courage. Davy's death came later, and with less ceremony than the world seemed to afford such reckonings. He was not reckless, as some would say. He was quick and careless, perhaps, but dangerous only in the way his joy could be contagious. He ran ahead sometimes, barefooted, calling to the others in a pitch that matched the wind. That afternoon he did not come back. They found him near the arroyo, where the water slid cold over its stones. The fighters said he had slipped, that his feet had been taken by river rock. The Baron's voice was measured when he made the announcement. He said words like accident and tragic, with a kindly distance as if dealing with death were a ledger item. But in the eyes of those who watched, there were contradictions. Boot prints where the earth should have no prints, a stick set aside as if it had struck once too many. The dogs were held away with hands that moved too slow. The men who counted their buttons and their hours did not ask too many questions. The funeral was small. They wrapped the child in a piece of dull cloth, and they dug in the cold earthen ground behind the labor quarters, away from where the Baronessa might look from the terrace, and be forced to acknowledge a life that had once laughed freely on the plantation. Candida carried the weight of the body, as if lifting her own heart from her chest. She had never been so quiet. She had never held silence like a stone. She stood over the grave and let the soil fall in a rhythm controlled by the hands that threw it. The bell did not toll for Davy. No official hymn was sung. Tomas dropped a clumsy fist over his face, and the world, with its rows of coffee and its polite men and its ledger books, carried on. And yet in that small hole the promise changed its face. Where once the promise had been a soft and private thing, a tether that kept siblings from being scattered, it hardened into something else. Grief is a teacher of edges, and Candida found it giving her instructions without speech. Something colder than sorrow began to settle in her ribs. It was concentration. It was a pulling toward a resolution whose shape she could not yet name. She felt the mother's hand, felt it tighten in her memory as if the years had passed and the grip had only grown stronger. "Keep them together," the voice said. "Keep them together no matter the cost." Memory does odd things in moments of rupture. It will feed an old image, a scrap of song, the way the wind sounded in a courtyard long ago. In Candida it fed the sound of the owl 3 times calling on the edge of the lot. It fed the scrape of a blade on stone, from when she had learned to sharpen the small knives used to peel coffee beans. It fed the sound of a bell's single, authoritative ring. All these notes stacked and made a chord that was not music, but an instruction. The promise had become a map to a place where action lived. She did not speak of revenge in the nights that followed. She did not stand at the well and announce a plan to the other enslaved people as if making a speech. She moved instead in small, deliberate ways. She watched Ricardo's hours, marked when he left the house and when he returned, noted the way Antonio drank himself dull on certain late afternoons when the bar was less watched. She noticed Paulo's pauses and the way he sometimes touched the hem of his sleeve when he thought no one noticed. She watched the Baron's ledger like a man might watch a tide, understanding where the currents ran and where they would carry the small boats. It is easy for storytellers to cast resolution as a single explosive moment. A shout, a fist, a blade, burst into the light. But in lives bound by restraint, plans are made of patience. The quietness of Candida's preparations was the new drumbeat. She began to collect the small things that might, in an eventuality, be arranged into action. A bit of oil for sharpening, a rag for hiding, the slow weighing of who could be trusted and who would be a danger. She asked Paulo quietly what times the dogs were fed, when the paths to the creek were least watched. He answered in ways that did not feel like promises, but like the slow unspooling of a rope someone might use to climb a wall. At night, when the house had emptied and the Baronesa's lamp burned in a glass that threw its glow like a coin, Candida sat by the well. She had found, in a storage room, 2 machetes used to cut back overgrown coffee canes and to split small pieces of wood. They were tools as much as they were symbols, long, heavy things with handles smoothed by use, blades that had been sharpened once, rusted in places. She took them in the moonlight and ran a whetstone along one edge, listening to the scrape like a heartbeat. She imagined the blade not as a thing that would be raised in a fury, but as a covenant, an instrument to keep a family whole. Even then she did not tell her siblings what she was doing. Tomas sensed, of course. Men and women who have lived under a constant rule of danger have instincts that read small changes in posture. He watched her at dusk, with a look that asked if she had gone mad, and a look that also asked whether madness might have a method. Madalena watched too, but with the innocence of someone still believing that a ribbon and a new braid might ward off calamity. There are small ethics to a plan, choices about who to tell and what to risk. Candida chose Paulo as the quiet node because he had left bread in hidden places and because she had seen him close his eyes when the Baron's men walked past the children. She entrusted Tomas with small tasks. A nail loose from a floorboard here, a crate moved there. Tomas did as he was told, with the stoic obedience of someone who had given his life to the service of another. He would not ask why. The owl's call continued to mark nights. When it called 3 times, Candida would still stop mid-motion and listen, as if the bird's refrain signed the sky and folded it back into the world. She catalogued routines like a woman making a ledger of human behavior. When Ricardo drank, when Antonio's stride faltered, the afternoon when the Baron went to São Paulo to see to paperwork and took with him the casual cruelty of being absent. The days were not all planning. There were small beauties that refused to be extinguished. Davi's laughter echoed from memory and found new ears in younger children. Madalena braided hair for other girls and learned to hum a tune no one else could place. Tomas taught Davy's friends to mend their sandals, and for a brief, fragile time the plantation felt like a place where life could be stitched along its seams rather than ripped apart by the greed of others. These tender practices were not irrelevant. They were ballast, the small acts of care that make a daring decision possible because they remind people what they are fighting to keep. The Baron himself remained a figure of composed indifference, not monstrous in a theatrical sense, but cold with the refinement of someone who believed property was a language that needed no conflicting dialect. When Candida once stood in the doorway of his office and said, in the plainest voice she could muster, "They are hurting my sister," he looked up from his ledger and frowned the way a man frowns at a line of ink marred by a spill. "Report to the foreman," he said, which was to ask the world to slide one level down and carry on. The Baronessa wrapped herself in polite concern and did not pursue matters that might sully her silverware. So the balance on the plantation grew more and more fragile. Small injustices stacked like dry wood. One forgotten ember might set the whole world alight. Candida sensed this in her bones. She felt the promise as a physical thing, like muscle memory. When the soft place where the hand had once pressed her palm tightened into a cord. "Keep them together," she rehearsed in silence. "Keep them together no matter the cost." The change, when it came, arrived like weather. A Thursday that started ordinary ended with an extraordinary quiet. Tomas had again been slow to respond to a command in the fields, and Antonio, who read any lack as an offense, had found reason to make a show of punishment. The lash is a language that the plantation uses to translate fear into order. Tomas took the blows. He did not cry out. He watched Candida from the corner of his eyes and tried to send a message with his face that said, "Do not let this kill you." But the lashes cut deeper than skin. They cut into the idea that protection was possible without cost. After the punishment, the men were mean with small torments, pushing, grabbing, an extra hour in the sun. That evening the Baron's house filled with a drunken company, men who had been drinking to dull conscience, and the garden was a place of shadows. Antonio, loose from oversight in his stupor, found Madalena carrying water between the kitchen and the sleeping room. The thing he wanted to take from that exchange was not a possession but the sense of control he had been taught to feel whenever desire and power met. He reached toward her in a way the narration will not describe in detail beyond saying that it was an attack, an attempt to take what he wanted without consent. Madalena's cry was swallowed by the clinking of glasses and the Baronessa's laughter inside the house. Tomas saw and moved. He intervened and was again punished for stepping beyond the bounds that the plantation had set. But while Tomas bore the outward scars, the deepest wound fell on a child who had not been given the language to protect herself. Madalena stood in the dim of the kitchen and pressed her hands against her mouth as if to keep sound from coming out at all. For days, she would not braid her hair. She would not take the ribbons from the other girls. Something in her had moved underground, where it waited like an animal skittish from a trap. The killing of Davy was not the first death on the lot, but for Candida it was the first that dissolved whatever fractions of hope she had retained. It exposed the web of impunity. Men like Antonio and Ricardo practiced intimidation as if it were law. The Baron in his removal allowed such lawlessness to thrive. The world's mechanisms to protect did not apply to people in their place. When the body was carried out and set in the small hole they had dug, the sound of the shovel in hard earth calibrated something irreversible. On the second night after the burial, Candida sat alone beneath the jacaranda. The sky was layered in bruises, an approaching storm that none of the laborers could afford to ignore. The owl called 3 times, and the sound stretched the night. She had been sharpening one of the old machetes in secret, a blade she had found among the tools. The stone rasped and sang in a low tone, and each stroke seemed to abrade whatever had softened in her heart until there was only an edge. She did not pray then, not aloud. She remembered only the sound of her mother's hand squeezing hers in the market, the small bones of a promise. Keep them together. The phrase moved through her like a key. The world had, for all its cruelty, left a seam that could be forced open if someone had the nerve and the will and the means. Candida thought of the machete not as a thing of murder, but as a way to make certain judgments stick to a surface, so the world could no longer say they had not occurred. She thought of the blade planted in the Baron's dining table, the image taking shape in her mind as if she had seen a singular act carved into the day, the machete standing upright in the wood like a verdict. Such images are dangerous. They can give a woman courage and they can give her nightmares. For Candida, they were tools of orientation. She began to practice invisible things, leaving an extra cup where a dog might sniff, loosening a latch so a door would groan and be blamed on rodents, mapping routes through the trees that might lead to the Quilombo that lay, as rumor suggested, 3 days' walk beyond the northern ridge. The Quilombo was a word soft with possibility, a place people spoke of in hushes as if mere mention might draw danger. But for those who believed in the possibility of being more than property, it was a beacon. Paulo became the quiet point of contact. He would nod and lower his eyes when Candida said the names of men she suspected. He left notes, small promises written on the back of torn cloth, which men who worked late could fold into their sleeves. He warned when the Baron planned to be away. He told Candida in a voice rough with worry the times the captains of the Mato had been seen in nearby towns. He did not give solutions so much as he handed her the tools of knowledge. When dogs were walked, which paths were rarely checked, when the Baronessa might host travelers who would distract the household. Knowledge on that farm was the first form of power Candida could count on. There are moments in plans when time stretches and contracts. Candida moved through hours with the sensation of preparing a mechanism. The wheel must be oiled, the chain checked, the lever set to respond. She called on Tomas for small tasks, fetching a crate from the back garden, moving a pot of ashes near a door to make it seem unused. Tomas did not ask questions. He simply carried out tasks with the same steady muscle that had always been his. Madalena, who had retreated into herself, responded in the minimal ways children sometimes do when adults make room for courage. She sorted garments, hiding a small ribbon in a place she thought would never be found. These were small rebellions, invisible to those who tallied production, but monumental to those who would carry a family through disappearance. Candida did not yet speak the words that would be necessary for the worst steps. She did not say revenge or kill. She said instead, in the whisper between heartbeats, keep them together. The phrase was a map, and she kept it as one might keep a locket containing a dead mother's hair, close to the chest and protected from the rain. In the courtyard, unseen by the Baronessa, who counted her silverware before bed, Candida walked to the tool shed. The moon was a thin coin in the sky. She lifted 2 machetes from their nails, feeling the grain of the handles. The metal was cold. She set one to the whetstone and began to sharpen, each stroke a steady song. Around her the world slept. Dogs breathed in their housings. The owl called once, then twice, and for a moment the third call did not come. She paused, listening as if the silence were a bell telling her to wait. At that pause, a footstep on the path halted her breath. It was only Tomas, moving with the quiet of a man who had seen more than he let on. He stood behind her and placed a hand on her shoulder, not to stop her but to align with her choice. They stood in the sieve of moonlight, 2 figures made small by the enormity of what stood before them. Candida felt again the memory of her mother's hand, felt the tightness and the command. She slid the blade back into its place and wrapped the whetstone in a rag. "What will you do?" Tomas asked, not with anger, but with the precise steadiness of a man who knew he was on the edge of a decision. "I will keep them together," she said. The words were the promise given shape. They were not vengeance for the sake of blood, but a methodical act meant to prevent the scattering of those she loved. Tomas nodded in a way that said he understood the logic of the impossible. Night held its breath. Rain, promised by the heavy clouds, began to fall in a slow, clean way, washing dust from leaves. The bell in the distance, the one that called men to their tasks in the morning, seemed suddenly to belong to another world, one that would make little notice of what was being plotted among the tools and the coffee trees. Candida wrapped the blades in a sack and slid them beneath the floorboards where the children stored their meager toys. It was a small act of concealment, but it mattered. Hiding is a kind of faith. As the rain rose in an odor of earth, she walked back to the kitchen. Inside, the heat of the hearth felt like a small human mercy. She washed her hands and dried them on a cloth, while the owl called a third time beyond the rafters. The sound fit like punctuation to the moment. Somewhere in a life before her, A mother had squeezed a child's hand in a marketplace and set forth a command that would outlast hunger and the slapping of lashes. The promise had become a blade of a different sort, a determinate will. There remained the question of when the promise's enforcement might begin. Plans must be timed to weather and watch, and the motions of men who could not suspect their own downfall. It was one thing to collect and sharpen tools. It was another to decide whose life would be risked and how many would be put in danger. The ache of that arithmetic is what made Candida return to the owl's three-note cry, as if some bird might answer with counsel. When morning came, it came like an accusation. The plantation moved in its practiced rhythms: bell, coffee, work. But the faces in the labor rows had a new gravity. Some looked at Candida with eyes that recognized a change they could not yet articulate. Others watched the barrow and wondered if he would notice the stirrings at the periphery of his estate. Candida moved through the day with the double vision of a person who can tend to a pot, while her mind measures the distance between the house and the woods, between the dogs and a man who might slip into sleep. She felt the promise like a heat under the skin, glowing and imperative. She did not yet speak the final words of the plan. She had not yet set dates. What she did in that day before the storm was 1,000 small acts of preparation: an extra knot in a rope, a scrap of cloth folded into a pocket, a look passed to Paolo, who would return that look with a small nod. It was in those unremarkable gestures that revolutions are often born: the quiet nods, the hidden tools, the careful reading of the hours. And then, at the height of afternoon, when sun flattened shadows against the coffee rows, something happened to rattle the thin control the plantation imagined it held. A foreman, rushing past the kitchen to fetch supplies, tripped and nearly spilled a crate of bottles. The noise was ordinary, a clatter that would have been forgotten. Yet in the arc of the sound, someone in the house looked up. It was a small thing. A man looked up and noticed. The ripple of attention is a dangerous currency in those places where men make rules. In the ripple, Candida heard the sound of a future snapping into place, and she understood that storms gather quickly once a sky decides to open. She kept her hands busy. She kept an ear to the owl's call and an eye to the bell. The promise had been made 2 decades ago in a place of commerce and abandonment. It had matured into a patient resolve. The harder question, the one that would swing the story forward, was how to break 20 years of silence without breaking the very thing she had sworn to protect. The answer would require more than a whetstone and a hidden blade. It would require timing, courage, and a brittle trust in a handful of people who might choose to risk everything. When the work bell finally fell quiet and the shadows thickened into the long chords of evening, Candida sat for a long while and let the silence press against her. It was a silence she had not chosen. It had been the silence of complicity, of hands that would not intervene. Yet now, with the shape of a plan growing in her mind, the silence felt like a thing waiting to be noticed, waiting to be broken. The promise had matured into a plan. The hand that had been let go in the market had rooted itself into action. Rain began to fall harder, and with it came a sense that something had changed in the air. The owl called 3 times in the jacaranda, insistent and steady. Candida rose, feeling the weight of the whetstone in her bones, as if it were the memory of a mother's palm. She gathered her small band of private knowledge, the blade wrapped under the floorboards, Paolo's nod to the east road, Tomas's quiet readiness, and set them like pieces on a board. The first moves were ready. She could not yet see the end of the game, but she could see the first steps, stark and necessary. Beyond the kitchen door in the wet dark, the farm breathed and settled. The bell was a distant heart. The baron would sleep in his house, the ledger closed, confident in a world that dismissed the possibility of revolt. Candida, with the rain on her face and the sound of an owl's third note still ringing, felt the promise as both incitement and armor. 20 years of silence had been part of life, yes, but so had the promise. It had never been a thing to be spoken aloud for fear of shaming those it protected. Now it had to be a thing that acted. Night folded itself tight over the plantation. Rain pelted the roof like a slow, insistent hand. Candida moved with the kind of silence learned from years of hiding in corners and behind kettles. The wheel of her plan had turned. Now it needed momentum. She had counted hours and men and dogs. She had placed trust in small, tested gestures. The first act had to arrive like a door closing, quick, undeniable, leaving no time for the world to murmur its excuses. Paolo was the first to act. He left the house at dusk with a basket of washing, his shoulders bent as if under the weight of linen. The basket held a folded scrap of cloth with a mark that Candida had taught her to make, the slight notch of a finger across a seam. It was a signal. He moved near the servant quarters and spilled the laundry in the dirt in a clumsy way that would force a fighter to come and help. It was the smallest of tricks, a pebble tossed into a pond to watch how the ripples behaved. Ricardo answered the pebble. He was slow and practical, the kind of man who trusted his own hands more than any counsel. That night he wandered toward the tool shed under the pretense of checking a broken saw. Candida had placed a crate so that the narrow path to the shed required him to stoop. Tomas, blending into darkness, watched from a folding roof of leaves. He had learned how to breathe without betraying himself. When Ricardo pushed the door, the lights within were dull. A single lantern burned close to exhaustion. The tools shed smelled of oil and damp wood and the stable breath of the horses. Candida, crouched in the shadow among stacks of empty sacks, moved like one whose body remembered the weight of a blade, the way a violinist remembers the curve of a bow. She waited until Ricardo had stepped completely inside and his back was turned. The strike was clean and fast. It was not the long, ornate motion of fury. It was a simple closing of the world. Ricardo fell with no grandeur, the lantern light quivering and going out like a star. A boot scraped the dirt, and then a soft hush as the men who had been watching from the trees slipped forward and carried his body away. There was no shouting. Outside, rain continued to write its sentences on the leaves. The tool shed had served its purpose. A man removed, a margin widened. That margin would buy the others minutes, then hours, but schedules on a plantation do not weep for delays. When men noticed a missing foreman, someone would ask questions. Someone would glance toward the servants' quarters, and the bell at the main house might call the dogs to attention. The margin was small and brittle. Antonio, rougher and hungrier for the cheap assertion of power, was harder to lure. He kept his habits tightly woven. He favored the open spaces near the creek at dusk. He liked the cooling air and the trickle of water that made the night sound private. Candida knew his pattern because she had watched him like a second heartbeat. She could not go to him directly. There were eyes always watching, but she could create an invitation that felt like a trap and a promise at once. Maddalena, who had retreated into her own quiet after the assaults and the funeral, became the bait, not because Candida wanted to risk her sister, but because Maddalena's fragile courage had begun to bloom into small acts of defiance. She had started carrying water in a stronger tin. She had left her hair unbraided like a flag. Maddalena agreed in a way that made the plan less monstrous. She would stand at the creek and twist her fingers in the way of someone waiting for a passing friend. The irony was unbearable. To save her, she would be asked to step into the very place that had once held menace. They wrapped her hands in cloth and taught her how to feign ignorance, how to let her breath seem careless. Tomas walked ahead on the chosen path to the creek, his posture a study in patience. Candida lingered at the margin of the plantation, where coffee trees thickened into a shadow. Paolo circled like a deliberate ghost, sketching the outline of where captains might come. The moon made a silver seam along the arroyo, and the night smelled of peeled bark and wet earth. Antonio came as men like him always came, loud with his own certainty, staggered by a belief that fear bowing was owed to him. He had been drinking, and the liquor made his gestures fat and easy. He saw Maddalena by the water, and he walked toward her like a man who thinks he is entitled to the silence of a night and the obedience of a child. Candida had not wanted to watch this moment with the intimacy of a spectator. She had practiced a face of calm, as if she might be the hearth that holds a pan in the middle of a storm. When Antonio reached for Maddalena, she stepped out as if to pull a cloth from her sister's arm. The movement was natural. Tomas was already behind, a shadow folding into him. The fight that followed was not long. It was precise, the kind of violence born of planning rather than rage. Words were not enough, and fury would have risked more than it could gain. Candida's blade met his body where muscle is most exposed. The motion repeated the sharpness she had stroked against the whetstone, and Antonio collapsed with a stunned curse. Madalena screamed once, and then found that her voice could be used to call others. "Get out now!" It was not a call for blood, as much as a call for space. There was no revelatory cheering. The others moved quickly, carrying the weight of men who had been the architects of so many small cruelties. There was the sound of hurried movement, the clatter of a lantern dropped, the hard breath of men who had come to do harm and had instead met an end. Candida did what she had to do. She did not relish the sound of a man falling. She felt only the cold satisfaction of a lock turned in a door long rusted. She slammed the last part of the plan into place inside the house itself. The Baron's dining room, with its carved jacaranda table and linen folded like promises, was the center of the plantation's image, the place where propriety is polished and injustice is allowed to appear palatable. Candida crept through servant corridors and found the way to the drawing room. The Baronessa was there, faint and dim from supper and in different posture. Candida had no interest in confronting the woman. She wanted only to lay a mark that would be read for what it was. She pulled the machete free of its rag, and with a motion both savage and ceremonial, planted it straight into the center of the Baron's table. The blade struck the wood and lodged. It stood upright, an accusation as much as a statement. The handle was dark from her grip. The metal glinted with the thunder of rain as if the night had signed the scene. If anyone would notice that a tool had been turned into an altar, it would be here. The dining room would now hold a story like a guest who could not be asked to leave. When morning smelled of wet earth and coffee, the estate found its seams frayed. Ricardo was missed. Antonio's absence, eventually noticed, was reported with the bluntness of men unaccustomed to reading between lines. The Baron rang his bell and ordered searches. Dogs were freed. Eyes scanned the horizon. Men in the house called names and found no answers. At first, the plantation seemed to fold in on itself with a secretive shame. The Baronessa wept politely, folding her hands as if the world might present a plausible reason for the cracks. The Baron's face hardened into a ledger's scowl. He closed the door to visitors and shaved the servants' hours into new forms of suspicion. The chains of habit tightened. More work, fewer rations, curfews slapped into place. Men were enraged, but it was a furor that could be directed at the weak. For the enslaved people, the night had already delivered its verdict. The margin bought with blood had become a corridor for escape. Candida had planned that others might slip into the forest, while their adversaries scrambled to account for the missing men and the planted blade. That plan depended on speed and the willingness of pockets of people to trust a daring they had not yet performed. The first to go were those who had long thought of flight, but had been held back by the calculus of children and old women, and the unknown expanse of the woods. They slipped past the corral, a few at a time, their feet finding paths that seemed to have been waiting for them. Night swallowed them like a mouth. Madalena and Tomas moved as if they were only following a routine extended into the dark, and the rhythm of their steps was the sort of thing that can flatten a fear. Candida did not leave before she had to. She stayed until the line of figures disappeared into trees, with the hush of someone shepherding the last of her flock. She counted heads in the shadow, and then, with a final check, she turned from the path and walked toward the trees that led away from the estate, but toward the sachet of rumor known as a quilombo. The first night outside the plantation was a small triumph. Wind felt different beyond the cultivated rows, smelling of grasses and a wildness the farm had not tended. The moon was not a coin, but a sliver. The group put distance between themselves and the lights of the house. There was whispering, little affirmations that they might yet belong to some future without a ledger. For the first time in many years, Madalena's breath came fuller. Tomas kept silent in his steady way, his chest mapping a quiet route of vigilance. 3 days of walking are not 3 days. They are a crude compression of hunger, fear, hope, and the slow stitch of feet across unknown land. Their march took them along ridges that gave glances over rivers, through scrub that scraped their legs, and beneath trees that remembered rain from decades before. They crossed old trails and read the forest like a book of signs. When food ran thin, they ate what roots they could find. When thirst pressed, they learned to find the bitter, sweet water that pools behind stones. The quilombo lay like a promise on the map of the spirit, unconfirmed to some, but to those who believed, a place with names and faces who would not sell the weary for profit. The scent of dogs came on the fourth day, like the memory of fear. Men with guns and a lust for return had been raised to the authority of pursuit. They had tracks and know-how and the discipline of men paid to capture. The barking closed like teeth. Candida felt the old weight of the market, hands let go, a promise pressed into a palm, and she knew the calculus. If they were caught as a group, all would return to suffering. If a gap opened, some might slip through. It was then that Candida made the decision she had rehearsed in the night. She would hold the hunters back. She would be the anchor that let the rest move. The thought did not come from playbook heroism. It came from the logic of the promise. Keep them together, she had been told. Keep them safe. The price had never been fixed. There had simply been the idea that some sacrificial accounting might one day be required. She had planned for this possibility, and yet the reality of it hit the ribs like a cold stone. She drew Tomas aside and spoke to him in the hush of leaves. "You go," she said. "Take Madalena. Go fast. Do not look back." Tomas, who had once turned his spine to bars of the lash to protect others, held her face in his hands, as if he might read the map written there. He did not argue. Men do not always argue in the face of certain things. He followed the two of them into the brush, moving with a silence that matched his entire life. Candida waited until their steps were muffled and the sound of their breathing became a thin thread. Then she dropped backward toward a small hollow where the underbrush made a shallow pit. She did not hide to be saved. She set herself in a place to be found. She pulled old scraps from her waist and wrapped them into small bundles, dragging them along to make false trails if needed. She then moved slowly, deliberately, leaving a spoor that might send the dogs in circles and the men following in wrong directions. She lit a small smoke in a cupped hand of dried leaves and let it burn with black smoke that would draw a dog's snout away from the true path. These were not the acts of a person who wanted glory. They were the acts of someone who had charted possibilities and chosen the one that would protect the living. The sound of hounds rose first, a wet, eager yelp that spread up the air like spilled oil. Then came men's voices, sharp with the satisfaction of pursuit. The huntsmen spread on the line, their boots eating the ground. Candida let herself be seen at last. A hunter slammed a branch and pointed. The dogs tore toward her smoke as if the scent were meant to be followed. Men swore and the dogs barked, but for a moment the chase tightened around Candida, like a cord looping. She did not run. She walked. She let them come. She had stolen time and she had given it away. There is a certain clarity in such moments. Life reduces to the mechanics of breath and the feel of water on the tongue and the shape of a promise like a weight on the chest. She heard Tomas's voice recede, then fall silent. She imagined Madalena stepping through undefined light toward the Quilombo. She allowed the hunters to close, to place hands upon her shoulders, to fold rough cords into her wrists. They dragged her back toward the plantation, the way a harvest returns to its ledgers. Men wanted spectacle and accountability. The Baron wanted a spectacle to be taken into town as a warning. Candida knew they would show her face to those who had made the trade of calling people property, and she felt no shame in the trade. She had done what her mother had asked 20 years earlier. She had kept them together. In custody, the small gestures of humanity persisted in strange ways. Paolo, who had helped from the margins, found himself hovering at the edge of the assembled men, like someone ashamed. He had left a loaf of bread at Tomas's hiding place once in the night, and in the flicker of a lantern he now watched Candida with something like grief. The Baron walked around his captive with a ledger's hand, touching cloth where a woman had been. He had a look like a reader finishing a page. He did not need to imagine the words. He had already decided what they meant. They held her in the yard as a lesson for others. The men who had not been taken were forced to watch. Their eyes slid away from her face, like a sun hiding behind cloud. Candida did not beg. She kept the small, stubborn posture of someone who knows why the heart must be heavy and who keeps it that way on purpose. She closed her eyes, more to taste the memory than to hide. In the hard hours that followed, when ropes cut her wrists and names were called, there came a short, private moment of light. Her mother's voice arrived in the place of memory, not as an actual voice that filled the air, but as a bright thing inside the chest, the warmth of a palm remembering a squeeze. "Keep them together," the hand said again, like an ancient practice. Candida answered in her mind with the news. They had reached the forest. They were moving. The promise had been kept. Within the chaos, men shouting, dogs panting, the Baron making notes, there came also small acts of disobedience that are the only kind that matter in such times. A woman who was a cook took the rag from her cloth bundle, and the soft dull of it brushed Candida's palm once as the other woman passed. A boy whom Candida had fed as a child looked at her without breaking away. Not everyone turned their face from the thing that had been done. These were little kindnesses that cost nothing and meant everything. Her death was not a stage spectacle. It happened in the blunt way of many such acts in those places, a scuffle, a misstep, the weight of men who did not wish to be tender. Her breath left, and the world then seemed to rearrange itself into its new shape. There was no thunder, there was rain, and rain does not celebrate nor announce. Yet even in that small and private ending, something large persisted. The fact that she had chosen to make the promise function rather than remain an ache. Word travelled imperfectly. Rumour, as it always does, filled in blanks and gilded edges. The estate said what it needed to say. An escaped slave died resisting capture. The ledger made the note and closed the chapter. Others told a different story in low voices. The woman who had been sold at market had held a promise and kept it. That story travelled in a different currency, memory rather than paperwork, and it had a life of its own. Thomas and Madalena reached the Quilombo with feet cut and hearts raw. They arrived not as the effigies of heroism, but as two people with a wound that would not close. People took them in with the simple rituals of a community that had learned how to hold those who arrived, as if each body carried an entire village's history. They were given a place to sleep, a pot of stew stretched thin, but shared as if it were the last treasure. They sat with others and told what they could, the way people tell truth to make it useful rather than ornamental. Madalena would not speak at first about the creek. Thomas would not tell of the lash. They only said that Candida had kept the promise. In the Quilombo, names acquired weight and bones acquired new places. People who had known only the margin of belonging began, with patient hands, to make small rites around remembrance. They washed the feet of those who arrived. They braided hair for young girls, and they told the story of the woman with a blade without the need to flinch at its moral complexity. The machete that had been thrust into the Baron's table, whether it remained, whether men later took it as a trophy, could not change what had been done. The symbol lived in conversation, the image of a blade planted in a table as if to say, "We do not accept your ledger of silence." The promise, "Keep them together," became an anthem. It was repeated as people stoked fires and mended clothing and taught children how to read the forest for water. Thomas, who had always been steady, learned how to teach others to stitch wounds and to track the route toward safety. Madalena, whose ribbon had once been a small ornament of shame and hope, braided names into her hair each evening, names of those who had not made it, and names of those who had. The act of passing the oath changed. It became not only a private instruction but a communal contract. Children heard it at dusk and repeated it as a way to remember the logic of survival. Years pulled like a slow thread. The Quilombo kept them and gave them new measures of life. Thomas took to teaching younger men how to read the sky and the creek. Madalena found, in her patience, a small joy in making cloth and teaching girls how to secure a ribbon that would not be stolen by fear. They had children who grew up with the story of a woman named Candida, whose name came to them wrapped in the smell of coffee and the sound of an owl's 3 calls. The story was told and retold, and in retelling it the community added not embellishments, but detail that hardened the memory into moral guidance. There were nights, in the quiet hours when the moon slid its pale hand over their faces, that Thomas would take a small, splintered piece of wood and cut with a knife the initials of Candida into a stick. He kept it near the hearth to remind himself of the cost and the necessity. Madalena taught her children how to braid and how to whisper the promise like prayer. Keep them together, not to make martyrdom fashionable, but to teach that family, solidarity, and memory are practices that require work and, if necessary, sacrifice. The machete, however it travelled after that night, held its place in the community's imagination. Some said it had been retrieved and kept hidden, Others said it was taken by the baron's servants and later melted down. Whether the physical object remained mattered less than the image. A tool lodged in the table as a statement that the house could no longer pretend nothing had happened. That picture became a way to teach children about the function of courage in a world that often rewards quiet complicity. Time does not wash away tragedy. It alchemizes it into something different, memory that insists, sometimes softly, and sometimes with the force of law, on telling names. The Quilombo told Candida's name. It placed her in songs, in a cadence that children would hum while they played, an odd lullaby that kept a promise alive. The story moved with the seasons, carried by breath and baking, by hands that mended and by the occasional elder who would stop where a fire glowed and speak it aloud. Memory, the narrator had learned, can be a form of justice in itself. To name is to refuse to let erasure win. The baron's ledger could list the missing and calculate the loss, but it could never translate a human name into the enfolding warmth of a remembered hand. In the Quilombo, Candida was not a footnote. She was a living grammar of resistance. Years later, when the children of Thomas and Madalena had grown and were themselves fathers and mothers, they would place a simple wooden marker near a tree on the outskirts of the community. It was not a grand monument. It was a plank with a cut made by a child's knife, and the initials carved clumsily in a loop, C.K. Candida kept. They planted it where the owl would still call sometimes, and they sat around it and told the story when the wind moved in a certain honest way. The plantation itself changed in small ways. The baron's house lost some of its sense of invincibility once the story of the blade and the escape travelled out beyond its walls. Men who had once believed in the straightforward arithmetic of profit found their ledgers complicated by rumour. Not all changes were fast, not all were visible. But the particular faith that says power is eternal had been given a fracture that did not seal. For those who stayed behind on the estate, life bore its own heavy rhythms. Some who had been near Candida felt a twinge of shame that the woman who had acted had to pay so high a price. Others hardened at the thought of the loss and called it the cost of order. The baron kept writing and the baronessa kept polishing the silver. Men died and were born, and the plantation continued to be a place where the language of demand held much sway. But across the ridge, in a small cluster of cabins and fields, a different tradition took root. At the center of that emerging tradition was the insistence on telling the true names of those who had been sold, beaten, buried without ceremony. The act of naming became a ritual, a story told at fireside, a child's question answered with a remembered face, the whisper of a vow passed into a child's ear, like a coin pressing into a palm. Keep them together was no longer only a promise between a mother and a little girl in a market. It was a law of belonging shared across generations. The narrator pauses, not to distance but to insist. There is a difference between vengeance and justice, between the appetite for blood and the need to secure the living. Candida's action sits in that difference. It was a brutal calculus, and yet it was aimed at opening a path away from perpetual harm. The machete planted in the table, the stolen hours, the dying breath, each operated within a world that refused to see certain people as fully human. Her defiance altered that ledger, not by filling the baron's books with new lines, but by ensuring the names of the small and the erased would keep echoing in other mouths. Remembering her is a kind of work. It asks more than a nod. It asks that we pronounce the names we know and the ones we have been taught to forget. It asks us to understand the cost of safety for some and danger for others. It asks us to carry forward the memory that small acts of love, feeding a child, hiding a blade, slipping a note into a palm, can be the bones of resistance. If Candida's promise moved you, share this story. Tell it to someone who may not have heard it. Remembering is a form of justice.